Leaping back to the earth, the main character of the story pulled the sword behind his back while the beast charged at him, and realized that it was tough to find a spot for a successful strike, and the odds of victory were not so clear. However, Xavier gripped the sword harder, and his nervousness somehow vanished, leaving him puzzled. Glancing at his mentor, who stood with a threatening expression, he believed that the mere fact of Lloyd's return boosted the chances of success. 2.5 hours earlier, the champion was riding Padong at an incredible pace. They were hopping from one rooftop to another, attempting to get nearer to the Titan. The aristocrat pressed himself closer to the creature and urged it not to approach too closely, thus avoiding detection. Observing Giga, the hero thought that they desperately needed to discover its vulnerability. Xavier again attempted to land a powerful hit with his sword. With a shout, he aimed it at the other arm, but it also had no impact. The champion gritted his teeth and clutched the phantom's fur, realizing that the warrior's strikes were entirely ineffective, and wondered what a beast with such power was made of. But then the idea started to resonate in his mind. Lloyd immediately felt motivated and furrowed his brow, believing that it was still possible to succeed. The young man quickly used the scanning ability and aimed it to the side. The Titan's armor glowed from the use of the skill on it. A blueprint of the creature with data details appeared in the hero's mind. The cunning one instantly grinned and, devising another strategy, thought that no matter how alive a creature Jigo was, it could be analyzed. The hero studied the blueprint and understood that its shell contained bone a meter thick. Zooming in on the image, he realized that the triple-layered structure overlapped at the tiniest level. Examining it even closer, the aristocrat understood that it was woven very densely and formed a sort of protective armor. At this moment, Xavier, with anger in his eyes, raised his sword to attack and yelled at the top of his voice. He drove it into the enemy's armor, causing a massive blast. Lloyd, who was observing the blueprint at this time, saw sudden changes in it and was very shocked. Turning his gaze to the head, the aristocrat noticed a buildup of energy in one spot. At that moment, Jiga raised its horn and released a wave from the tip. The champion, watching this, pressed himself closer to the phantom and thought that he needed to drain the horn to gather all the energy and then unleash it, and for this, he first needed to remove this appendage. In the virtual mode, an organ was displayed leading to it, and the hero thought that this area with a water sac would need to be struck. Then on the display, the beast's body was ripped apart with one thrust. In Lloyd's mind, the idea emerged that they could handle it, but then Xavier, who was standing below, looked at his mentor with concern and asked what he should do. Then he began to point at the horns with gestures with a stern expression, and then he waved 2 fingers under the horn. The warrior was utterly confused and asked if Lloyd had lost his mind. Then the already furious aristocrat began to wave his hands and fingers rapidly and shouted at him to sever the horn. The talon flew at the fair-haired man, and it seemed it was about to hit him. There was a strike that scattered dust around, but from there Xavier soared upward with spins, holding his sword in his hands and thus evading the talon. The young prodigy, trying to avoid the attacks, thought that attempting to cut off the horn could be deadly, but his mentor, the skilled warrior, having dodged another strike, flew past the scales, and while the limb attempted to hit the warrior, he tried to slow down and believed that Lloyd was accountable for his words. The fair-haired man took off at great speed, and while his eyes burned with rage, he shouted his cry loudly. The champion tried to stop him with a yell and warn him and say that it would not be simple at all, but the strength of the mana rings is not only in the strike. Xavier, already near the horn, asked what he should do. Raising the sword above his head, he continued saying that though he was weak, he was quick, and at high speed. The warrior delivered a slashing strike from top to bottom while infusing mana and asked if it would be simple. The rings of mana began to swirl and cross repeatedly, thus creating a pattern and speeding up faster. The fair-haired man, clenching his jaw, held the sword to the horn and poured in his mana with all his strength. Lloyd, seeing this, grinned, clenching his fist, thinking about what they had achieved because these were real electric saws made of mana, and after all, it was just a theory. Then he saw Xavier battling, yelling loudly, and thought about how he had never doubted him. Waves of energy spread from Giga's head in various directions under his screams. The talon again flew rapidly toward the fair-haired man while he was trying to saw through the horn, but Padong extended his paws forward and was about to leap at the hero's command. The creature struck the Titan's talon with his back, knocking it off and giving him the chance to complete what he had begun. The warrior clenched his jaw even tighter and sawed with even greater effort. The appendage was finally detached from the body with the help of a magic saw. The beast began to bellow while water poured out of it. The horn, filled with liquid, spun rapidly and fell to the ground, splashing water, and after a few moments, the piece lodged into the earth not far from the champion, who stood proudly on the rooftop. He yelled with all his strength for Xavier that he needed to strike the center from the direction of the tail diagonally to the head. The fair-haired man began to rush at great speed under the Titan's body. He stopped suddenly, gripping the ground. After hearing that if they hit in this direction, Lloyd frowned and shouted loudly that they could gain some time if they did so. The warrior raised his sword back slightly and was preparing to pierce the armor with a thrust, but then a huge beast began to collapse dead right on him. Xavier was stunned by this and froze in place. Giga fell with all its weight on the city. Only the rapier of the champion warrior flew out from under him. The hero was extremely horrified by what he saw and, realizing what was happening, he loudly called out to his subordinate, but then we go back a little. The skilled warrior stood in his stance for a thrust before falling. He clenched his jaw and was about to strike the enemy, ordering it to perish. Mana filled his entire body, even his hair, and the young man heard a similar command in his mind. But as it turned out, Padang was already rushing to his aid. The hamster grabbed the warrior by the collar as he ran, which surprised him greatly. The creature managed to save him right before he fell, and then he slowed down after running a little. Lloyd was glad of his rescue and nervously clenched his fists and praised his pet. At this time, the familiar tried to stop the warrior by waving his paws, but he politely apologized and said that he did not understand him. Xavier picked up the rapier from the ground and said that perhaps he was now scolding him for his recklessness, and then he turned to the beast and, standing in a stance, suggested that he stand until victory. Seeing his mentor in the distance, the Blade Master said that he trusted in the hero's plan, and he at that moment frowned and thought that Plan D was devised quickly after a successful scan, but it was very challenging to carry out due to the incredible speed of the Mega Titan. Looking at the enormous size of the enemy, the champion thought that they should execute this plan because this is the only way to defeat it. The hero opened his eyes wide and frowned and decided to merge plans, and he immediately turned to Pip, who was standing below. The creature jumped to the owner. Lloyd climbed on it and said that they were heading to the place he told him about. Passing by the warrior, the aristocrat shouted to him, mentioning that Jiga recognized him as a danger and was moving to the east, and suggested luring him into the forest, to which the subordinate instantly agreed. The hero was riding at full speed and was worried that they had gained only a little time, though it should be enough. He clenched his jaw and exhaled heavily, thinking that all hope was on the count. And again we are taken 15 minutes back. Kriya watched the beast swimming to the city from the ship and froze. There was fear on his face and he wondered how this was possible and did not understand why the statue did not help. Genevin carefully approached him from behind and, regretfully looking away, asked him to forgive him, because if he had sensed it earlier. But the Count, propping up his head, said that he was not to blame for anything, and it was he who was too careless. Then the bearded man recalled the pieces of the statue and wondered how he could believe that some statue would protect them from the beast. Then Lloyd swam up to the ship on a snake and said that everything was wrong, and the Titan was chasing the statue, and everyone was glad that he was alive. The champion said with a serious expression that he was certain that this beast had come to destroy the statue, and was going to use its obsession against it. While Creo was listening to him attentively, the young man said that while he and Xavier would gain them some time, they would have to. We return to the present again. The Titan without a horn is chasing the warrior, trying to crush him. He tries to strike him repeatedly by hitting the ground with his claws. The Blade Master stopped on the earth after another assault and tried to catch his breath. Getting to his feet, the fair-haired man saw this massive creature in front of him and could not catch his breath. The young man was sweating and thinking that he could not continue, and his limit was already near, but then he clenched his jaw and pulled himself together. Xavier suddenly took off, and while running, he thought that now his main task was the city, namely to protect the safety of the residents. The Titan demolished everything in its path and ran with its mouth open. The fair-haired man was on his last legs, his mind was already foggy and he could not breathe. The danger was right behind him, and then, when death was almost overtaking him, Lloyd appeared and shouted that he needed to be louder and ordered to go to the statue. The warrior instantly came to his senses and calmed down. The cart was rushing at great speed, scattering dust. Jiga saw it and became enraged. In front of him was that very hated statue. The champion was grinning widely astride a cart. The fair-haired man was shocked to realize what he saw in front of him. Padon was pulling a cart with a statue with dangling limbs, and the hero was shouting insults and calling for an attack. Then the beast reached the extreme level of fury and froze for a moment. The Titan let out a wild scream that was heard throughout the area. Lloyd put a wild grin on his face and thought that he liked this reaction. And then he recalled how they secured the statue, and thought that they even surpassed themselves, and that it was still the right choice to trust the Count. The young man instantly called Xavier with a worried expression and said what he would do when he opened the door, and he attacked. The warrior, frowning as he ran, asked him to tell him the entire plan next time. Having run past each other, the hero said with concern that this should not happen again. The hamster turned sharply with a whistle and began to flee from the beast. The creature ran away from the Titan with fear on his face, and Lloyd cursed while driving. At this time, Xavier tore off the ground and flew forward head first and rushed toward the target. He raised his rapier again to strike under the beast's belly. The fair-haired man gritted his teeth with all his might and was full of resolve. The next attack was a sword strike. Fire energy surrounded the blade, which rushed forward. The warrior was able to hit at the intersection of the armor and use the explosion. Jiga was blown up by the blast and lifted up. The champion, seeing this, was very shocked and turned around. The Titan stood still in the forest and smoked, and the fair-haired man himself was falling backward at that moment and watched the results of the attack. All he managed to do was simply pierce the armor but did not damage anything. Seeing this, he thought that he was only able to harm the skin, but a huge amount of force was used. But then the young man, falling down, changed his mind and thought that this was just an excuse and wondered if he was so weak that he could not protect the people. Suddenly, a loud voice of his lord was heard, who praised him for successfully completing the task. The fair-haired man opened his eyes wide and was very shocked. The hero was riding a hamster quickly toward him and said that the Titan armor. Lloyd's eyes were full of resolve and courage, and raising his shovel, the champion said that he was taking on this task. Xavier fell down and thought that he had gathered all his energy for this last strike, and now his mind was clouded, he could rest in peace. Lloyd frowned and shouted to leave it to him. Xavier closed his eyes and wondered why the Lord said so. Hippo flew forward. The blue-haired man dropped down on him. The champion frowned and told his companion to rest. The city needed to be protected. He thought that although he was running and yelling, he himself was not certain that he would succeed. The young man thought about how he could take the beast away from the city and finish it off. There was no certainty that it would not return back. The Creo Sea had already become a home for mega titans. The beast was destroying the village. Lloyd thought that it had intelligence and could cause even more damage, wanting revenge. Padong ran forward and thought that he was at his maximum and could no longer do more. The champion shouted the moment had come. The creature slowed down. Lloyd prepared to strike. Padong threw him up to the beast. The brunette swung and thought that everything he could do now seemed clear. What could he do? He thought that earlier when he chose to save the city and make his contribution following the plans, he joined the attack. Lloyd frowned and thought that he should blow it up. He had no other choice. He thought that he needed triple rings to blow it up, but now he only had double rings. Lloyd frowned and started calling the app, the skill window, the awkward bot. The system window appeared. The champion thought that he needed to advance. The system window said that 190 PR was needed. Lloyd thought that this was a scam, but now it didn't matter, he would figure it out later. He pressed the advance button. The young man saw that now 220 points were needed to advance. He thought that it would be tough for him. Lloyd advanced one level after another and thought that he would get a discount. Suddenly his pupils narrowed. The system window said that 370 PR was needed to advance. Sweat began to run down his face. His PR balance was 311. Lloyd gritted his teeth and thought that there was nothing he could do about it. It seemed that he had no plans to get into a fight. He had made a sensible choice. The champion held the shovel and wondered what he was even doing hanging here in the air. Xavier opened his eyes. The brunette held the shovel in his teeth and wondered whether he should just use mana and strike, and if there was even a small wound bite. The blue-haired man closed his eyes. A system window appeared that his sympathy level had increased and was now +5. The champion frowned. A system window appeared that his PR balance was now 391. Lloyd gritted his teeth and thought that the triple rings should appear now. The system window said that the level was obtained. Double rings shone in the sky. Suddenly another star lit up. A system window appeared that the triple rings technique was learned. Lloyd thrust the shovel into the beast and thought that one ring protected the heart. The beast's paw was rushing toward the ground, then it sank into the earth. The champion swung and screamed. A stone was flying toward him. It hit him right in the head. Lloyd's eyes widened, and he wondered what it was. He let go of his hand. The young man looked ahead in shock and thought that he couldn't fall. He needed to unhook another ring. One ring appeared in the sky, then a second one appeared next to it. A third ring appeared next to it. The champion thought that there would be a collision now. Lloyd began to fall. He looked at the sky. There was a powerful blast. The champion aimed the shovel at the beast's wound. He came closer. There was an explosion. The beast roared, then it fell to the ground. People looked at the column of smoke. The dust near the dragon's body cleared. The moon was shining. The animals looked at the young man. Xavier opened his eyes. He got up and said that everyone was safe. The blue-haired man looked away. He looked at the dead beast and said that he could answer for his words, but how did he do it? Padong took his little finger. He asked what was wrong with him. Did he really want him to follow him? All the animals ran forward. Lloyd was lying on the ground. Xavier's eyes widened. The champion was staring into space. The young man ran to him and called him. He put his ear to his chest. The blue-haired man frowned. He looked at the mentor and said that his heart stopped. The bird flapped its wings. It flew over the settlement. The pigeon flew past the building. Arcus looked away when there was a knock. The carrier pigeon saluted him. The brunette took the letter and said that it was from Count Creo. What was the matter? Suddenly his face darkened. He threw the saddle on the horse. The man pulled on the reins and screamed. Arcus galloped forward and thought about Lloyd. His eyebrows rose, thinking of how many times he had scolded him for putting himself in danger. The letter was addressed to the Baron, informing him that his eldest son had completed the construction in Creo with incredible success. Marbella had caught up with her husband and was shouting at him to wait for her. How could he just leave without a plan? Arcus looked at her and said that even without stopping, the road was long, which was why only he and Bayan were riding. She replied that he was saying such things had he forgotten. She frowned and said that she was much better in the saddle than he was. The letter went on to say that almost immediately after the construction was completed, the city of Creo came under attack. 3 horsemen were racing forward. The letter said that at this critical moment, Lloyd and his companion Xavier, having gathered all their courage, sacrificed themselves to save the residents of the city. The 3 horsemen were making their way through a snowstorm. The letter said that Lloyd had ended up in a coma. Arcus squinted and thought that Lloyd was the most hated troublemaker, but now his son had become the most diligent and reliable person. The letter continued that they thought it would be important for Arcus to know about this as soon as possible, so he was writing this letter. He would wait to meet the parents of this extraordinary man. The man frowned and thought about his son. The young man smiled and said that he was asking the Baron's permission. He frowned and told the Baron not to worry, he would do well. Lloyd bowed and said that he paid his respects to the Baron. Arcus looked ahead and thought, could this really be his son? The beast stepped on the snow. The riders looked at it in shock. There was a beast in front of them. The horse reared up in fear. The man got off. Bayan frowned and said that they could not escape. This was the shortest way. It would buy them some time and they must find another way to Creo. Arcus said that he must run. He replied that these creatures were faster than words. As soon as he turned around, they would cut off his head. The beast ran at him. The man turned around and shouted at them to run faster. The beast swung its paw. Bayan parried the blow. Arcus turned around and asked for his forgiveness. He said that they would meet in Creo. The beast began to attack. Bayan gripped his sword tighter and parried the attack. Part of his sword flew off. He looked ahead in shock. The beast bit his shoulder. The man took out a dagger and plunged it into the beast's head. It knocked Baron to the ground. He clenched his jaw. The beast bit his shoulder harder. The man screamed in pain. Arcus swung his sword. It pierced the beast. Marbella also ran forward with her sword. She pierced the beast with it. It stood up and screamed. The beast fell to the ground. It was shaking in pain. People looked at it. Arcus approached Baron and asked if he could stand. He replied that he was ashamed of himself as a knight. The man frowned and said that he was also his feudal lord, which meant that he had to be responsible for his people. He turned around when Marbella called him. He asked if she was hurt. His pupils narrowed in shock. In front of them was a whole pack of beasts. Bayan stood up. He pulled the sword out of the beast and raised it against the pack. The beasts ran at him. The man ran toward them. Marbella clung to her husband. Suddenly Xavier appeared. He landed on the ground. The beasts looked at him. The young man chopped off one head. He continued chopping off one head after another. The blue-haired boy sheathed his sword. He raised his head and said that he went to meet them just in case. The boy held the sword and asked if they were okay. Baron looked at him in shock and thought that he knew that Xavier had made progress with magic and developed mana. But he was not that strong even before leaving for Creo. What made him so strong? Xavier looked down. The blue-haired boy approached the hero's parents. Marbella raised her eyebrows and asked if Lloyd was okay. He lowered his head. He looked at his parents and said that he did not know if he was alive or not. Dust was coming from the beast. Xavier looked at the champion in shock. He darkened and thought that he refused to believe it if he was gone now. Lloyd looked into space. The boy took his hand. He closed his eyes and thought that he would lose their estate, his newly acquired home. Xavier leaned over his mentor. He looked at his hand in shock. The blue-haired man put his hand on the champion's neck and thought that his pulse was beating, but his heart had stopped. He noticed that, albeit weakly, he was breathing. The young man opened his eyes and wondered how this was possible. He frowned. He saw triple rings and thought that they were spinning at an incredible speed. Xavier put his hand on the champion's chest and thought that it was tough for him to know about the state of his heart. He could not check because of the magnetic field. This incredible movement of mana was in his heart, and it was mana that kept him alive. He thought that he had created a triple blast, and now he understood how the Mega Titan met its end. The blue-haired man looked at the brunette and wondered who he was. After some time, the builders were repairing the house. The men were carrying stones. Arcus and Marbella were looking around. Xavier said that Mr. Lloyd was in the Count's house. The doctor was looking after him there, but so far without any special changes. The man raised his eyebrows and said that it all looked scary, just Lloyd and him against the beast that did all this. The young man, without turning around, said that it was all thanks to Lloyd. He walked forward and said that only the mentor's power helped kill the beast. The parents looked at him worriedly and wondered, is it possible that their son has such power? The man behind Arcus asked if they were going to the Count too. The other replied that since he can't help here, wouldn't it be better to go there? Arcus looked at them when one of them said that if it weren't for Lloyd, he would have frozen to death by now. It's hard to imagine how many people he saved while getting to the Mega Titan. Lloyd helped the man get out of the water. The man walked forward and said that he couldn't even move, thought he was going to die, and had already given up and was waiting for death. The champion held a shovel and told Belle to absorb the debris so as not to hurt anyone. The woman put her hand to her mouth and said that she thought the fire had started from some fragments of the statue. If it had remained like that, the city would have turned into a sea of fire. Hippo was putting out the fire. The citizen said, "Did everyone see how he appeared out of nowhere and swallowed a huge amount of water and put out the fire?" Xavier and company walked forward. People around were saying that it was hard to imagine how many people were now in debt to Lloyd. Many people were standing outside the Count's house. People bowed their heads and thought that they hoped that the savior of fathers, wives, mothers, all of them, would open their eyes. Lloyd was lying in bed. The citizens turned around when someone shouted, "Were they all crazy?" The young man frowned and said that if that guy hadn't put up that statue, none of this would have happened. He raised a finger and said that if he thought about it, it was all his fault. People were looking at him. The crowd began to discuss and quickly suppress the man. The champion's heart was beating. A system window appeared that his sacrifice and courage made a great impression on the residents of the city. For such an achievement he was entitled to a bonus. Lloyd squinted. He opened his eyes. The young man stood up and said that he had a headache. He opened his eye and said that he remembered how recklessly he used the triple blast. Was he even alive now? A system window appeared that if he were dead, he would not be able to see dreams. Lloyd looked at the system window and asked how this was possible. Wasn't his heart part of the settings? He was told that he would gradually learn everything. A system window appeared that he should pay attention to more important things. Someone entered his room. Xavier looked at him in shock. The brunette looked at him and said that he was just in time. He frowned and asked when they were promised to pay for the work. The blue-haired man looked at him and said that he saw that he was already better. He smiled. Lloyd raised an eyebrow and his name was called. His parents ran to him. They hugged him. The man cried and said he was fine, what a wretch he was, and his mother said it was a relief. Did he know how worried they were? Arcus thought it didn't matter if it was really their Lloyd, he was just grateful he was alive. The boy smiled. After a while, Royal Road Magenta, the man said, "It says here that the Mega Titan is dead and no longer a danger." Those are the last words in Count Creo's message. He bowed to the king. He said that it was very interesting that such an unusual young man had appeared on his lands. The man bowed when the king said to send a message to the frontier estate inviting him. That night, Queen Alicia looked ahead and said that she would decide whether what was described was true or not after a personal meeting. Notification: word of your courage and sacrifice is spreading throughout the country. The champion crossed his arms and stared at the system window. For increasing your reputation in society, you are entitled to bonus RP. You receive plus 150 points. The young man clenched his fists and smiled happily. New skill: Mana Heart, accumulating a high concentration of mana in the heart. The young man touched his chest and thought that it was no wonder that he had so much energy, although he had been in a coma for a month. The fact that mana appeared in his heart meant one thing. The brown-haired man frowned and realized that working with a shovel would be much easier. The system asked if that was all he cared about. The boy was surprised that she disdainfully treated hardworking workers. A message appeared in front of him with an apology. The system reported that his mana heart appeared not due to training, but because of the shockwave from the blast. Based on this, his mana heart has unique abilities. The champion's eyes widened in surprise. Exclusive skill option: impact compensation. Even if it is impossible to defend, the option allows you to minimize the impact of the blast. Lloyd narrowed his eyes and thought that this meant that he could use triple strike whenever he wanted. The young man clenched his fist and was glad that the mining would go faster. The system asked him to say something cooler. The aristocrat asked what could be cooler than work, or was she now also belittling mining? An apology followed immediately. The reason why the mana heart needs protection from the effects of the blast is that mana is like an ammunition depot. Just bring a match to it and everything will blow up. Since the consequences of the blow are catastrophic if you do not protect your heart, then get ready to say goodbye to life. But at that moment, the champion did not have a mana heart. Thanks to this, he is still alive. The shockwave settled in his heart. The brown-haired man touched his chest and noticed that trying to save his life, the wave turned into a big heart. The fellow sighed and thought that, while his dear heart was carefully growing, he did not see it, believing that swinging a shovel was much more helpful. Sometimes it does not hurt to act silly. Count Creo climbed into the wagon and, saying sorry for the delay, suggested that they depart right away. The hero stared closely to the side and licked his lips. The wagon moved along the road. Lloyd rested his cheek on his hand, gazing out the window, and asked how much cash would be needed to fix the building on the path. The count tilted his head and answered that the expenses could surpass the city's monthly funds. The young man put on a stern face and said that, if the Mega Titan had not perished, the amount could have gone beyond the yearly funds. The man grimaced and, scowling, asked what he meant by that. The hero crossed his legs and mumbled that, compared to the yearly funds, the payment he got could not even be called small change. The fellow added that the statue built to battle the Mega Titan had caused such a calamity. The listener quietly lowered his chin. Lloyd continued that one cannot fault someone for their decision, because this choice was made by nature itself. The count started to perspire. The nobleman said that it was still good that there were folks ready to give up their lives. The young man grinned and recalled that he had overheard the workers saying that those who tried, for the benefit of the town's folks, no matter their rank, were surely entitled to financial reward. He was curious to know how strong the interests of the town's folks should be. Primo froze and said 1.5 times. There was a silence in the wagon. The man scowled and asked if that was enough. The listener replied that there had been a mix-up, and he had not asked for extra cash. The fellow looked out the window and said that he now knew that, for a lord, the lives of the town's folks were only worth an increase of 1.5 times the total sum. The count shivered. The wheels rattled on the road. The man scowled and said that he was doubling. The brown-haired fellow did not pull himself away from viewing the scenery outside the window. Sweat was streaming down the listener's face. He looked anxiously at the hero and shouted that he was tripling. Lloyd's creepy smile was visible in the reflection of the glass, which gave the count chills. Creo looked tiredly at the extended hand. The brown-haired fellow smiled gently and said that he was amazed by such a sensible spending of funds. He would think about this reward and put the cash in the right place. The man shook his hand and agreed. The Lord thought that this was a wild, odd demand of pure money. However, he did not dislike the fellow, did not even get annoyed, looking at his pleased smile. The townsfolk turned around, noticing the Count's wagon. People gathered around them, yelling the main character's name. The young man grinned shyly and thought that, in Korea, he was just a piece of garbage. Creo grinned and said that there were even magic orbs placed on the platform that boost the sound. All the residents really wanted to hear the fellow. The hero looked away and thought that he would have to say something inspiring and brave. A huge crowd gazed at the young man standing on the stage and shouted his name. Lloyd sighed and took the orb, wondering how many folks were there. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on him in expectation. The fellow took a deep breath and thought that, if he could get cash from everyone present, that would be great. To the shocked looks, the brown-haired fellow raised his finger and asked if the folks had heard about the warming system. The stunned spectators stared at him in silence. The young man looked around and, covering his face with his hand, muttered that they were not aware. The hero put his hands on the table and spoke to the older folks, suffering from aching joints in the winter, and the parents, who were worried that their kids would get sick. The townsfolk listened in confusion, as the nobleman asked them how much time they had squandered trying to start a fire. Lloyd scowled and shouted that an hour or two, and if they were already over 50, then they had already wasted 15 years of their lives. The Count glanced sideways at the young man who was yelling about the warming system and trembled. The brown-haired fellow scowled and showed with his hands how much the quality of life of all the town's folks would improve. The fellow closed his eyes and added that, if they wanted to get more details, then welcome to the Frontier estate. With that, he ended his promotion and turned around. Creo turned around and thought that there was a reason why he couldn't dislike this young man. He was careful in money matters, persistent but fair. Besides, the young man did everything he had to. Instead of disliking him, the Count wanted to make him his assistant. It would be too foolish to keep him in such a remote place where he came from, the Frontier estate, which would be his sweet gold mine. And the chief knight here was Master Bear. Honest, genuine, hardworking, all good, but compared to his effort, his knightly skills were ordinary, maybe even worse. The hero thought that this was an issue. Lloyd looked at his listener in surprise. There, with a cast on his left arm, he laid out the papers in front of him and reported that all the preparations were done. The list of land sharing was presented in this document. They decided to tackle the problem of the shortage of workers on the farms, while the members of the Orc tribe would fully work in the mines. The man closed his eyes and added that, thanks to the nearby estate, they managed to sign a big deal for the setup of a warming system with a 30% discount. The net profit rate would be 10%, but given the turnover of coal, the final net profit rate surpassed 50%. The warrior wanted to keep talking about waterproofing and fixing, but the young man asked him to slow down. The fellow grinned tightly and asked if he had really been doing all this while he was gone. Baron looked curiously at the young gentleman and replied that he had simply done his request to watch everything while he was away. A young man entered the door and reported to the main knight that the last stage of the warming system had been laid. A check was needed. The swordsman turned around and said that he would be there in 30 minutes. The hero watched as Baron inspected the work done. The man grinned and praised the workers for doing everything without a single error. The workers grinned shyly. The knight asked them to remember that it was for moments like these that he had been shouting at them. They were now the most important members of their team. Lloyd stared at him in shock. He admired how educated the man was. This fellow was born at the wrong time. If they were in Korea, he would have been the boss of some big company. The young man decided that he definitely needed to be rewarded. Notification: the Frontier Estate's home floor warming system has been finished. The Frontier-style floor warming system will appear in the pages of the continent's history. A huge amount of RP will be awarded for amazing achievements in building. Bonus RP, plus 400. It turned out that such a large flow of orders for the warming system was the work of the Baron and Baroness. It turned out that these folks had something to offer besides the estate. Since the moment of his birth, he had been fortunate, and now, thanks to the new generation, many will either weep or chuckle. The hero tossed the shovel over his shoulder and watched the progress of building together with the knight. Xavier raised his head and guessed that such a big storage place would be needed to store coal. The young man agreed because endless streams of coal awaited them. He grinned and thought that, thanks to the building fee, he was able to pay off more than half of their debt, and he also had water checks from their neighbor waiting for him. Lloyd grinned crookedly and was glad that he was close to a worry-free life. The swordsman glanced sideways at his grin. The fellow did not show emotions, but he thought that this facial expression, which he saw from time to time, annoyed him and stirred the urge to hit the master. The doom sounded. The listeners turned around, and the brown-haired fellow asked where the sound was coming from. Xavier replied that he had never heard it before, but the trumpet usually announced the arrival of a royal messenger. A man on horseback, surrounded by knights and workers, was nearing them. The hero raised an eyebrow, not understanding where a royal messenger could come from. A red carpet was spread out on the ground, and the guest gracefully jumped down from his horse onto it. He tossed the scroll with a smooth gesture and, catching it with one hand, opened it. The crowd clapped for him with admiration. The Baron's family knelt, and Lloyd mentally asked to get to the point. He gritted his teeth and realized that he was about to die from this odd feeling. The guest looked at the scroll and read that, since ancient times, great kings did something there for the sake of peace and ease of the nobility and other citizens. The young man scowled and guessed that it was Creo in the background. The messenger muttered his speech. The man grandly declared that, inspired by such ideas, Her Majesty said the two brave heroes who defeated the Mega Titan must personally appear before her and be rewarded for their deeds. Notification: the Baron's interest is raised by 9 points. You have been awarded 90 RP. Arcus held back tears and said that he was so proud of his son. The brown-haired fellow clenched his teeth and thought that he was thankful for the points, but this was a very bad sign. He had already been through this in the army. It was enough to simply do the job without issues, but you can't do better than needed, and you only have to break this rule. The hero recalled how, having learned about his skills and knowledge, he was forced to build various houses, saunas, and barracks. If the young man got involved with the monarch, then you can forget about the calm life of a noble in the countryside. The messenger opened his mouth wide and shouted that the orders were for Lloyd Fra and his guard to leave for the King's Road right away. The boy's eyes filled with tears, realizing that he should have stopped at the ceiling of the Seabed. That darn lobster had cursed him. He wondered what he was going to do now. If the monarch picked him, he would have to work for him for the rest of his life. He could try to act dumb, but then they might cut off his head. The wagon drove through the woods, surrounded by guards. The hero's face sank, looking down with an empty stare. Xavier looked at the gentleman and noted that he looked as if he had been sentenced to death. The young man agreed and looked curiously at his listener, when the latter said that this was surprising. The knight crossed his arms and said that, if it were Mr. Lloyd, he would be thrilled, thinking that he could get rich at the monarch's expense. The brown-haired fellow looked at the swordsman carefully and thought that he had details the identity of Queen Magenta, her future, the situation on the royal road. If the hero uses all this information, then he has a chance. Xavier is right. If the situation turned out this way, then he should use it to his benefit. The fellow grinned boldly and thought that this would be needed against the royal road. After a while, the main character and his guard bowed, greeting the queen. The ruler ordered them to lift their heads, and the brown-haired fellow looked at her closely. A red-haired woman in a cloak stood above him. Lloyd grinned tensely and thought that, at some point, he was even scared. Her presence was no joke. The brown-haired fellow lowered his head and greeted the queen as a true leader of the royal road. The listener raised an eyebrow and said that she thought the second fellow was a noble. The hero froze, already used to such a reaction. The woman grinned and said that she could sense the flow of unique energy inside Xavier. She added that the fellow looked like he could challenge her. The blonde closed his eyes and politely replied that he was just a guard. The young man scowled and thought that the queen understood at one glance that the knight was special, as expected from one of the two best sword experts in the kingdom. Alicia looked down closely. You can't mess around with her. The woman said that she heard about his success from Count Creo, so she praised him for his bravery and sacrifice. She stood in front of the guests without a hint of a smile. The queen said that she would not judge a person only by someone else's tales, and would believe it when she saw it herself. The hero scowled and thought that he didn't even doubt it. The redhead narrowed her eyes and said that she would personally assess his abilities. The young man grinned and realized that this was a special chance to receive a royal order. Alicia asked what, in the current situation and the time they live in, most needs urgent rebuilding on the royal road Magenta. The hero lowered his head and noted that they decided to start with puzzles. He grinned because he knew the plot of the entire story. The queen looked at him and thought that the fellow would quickly notice it if he was gifted, but if he was not able to see it, then she would not be able to accept him. They exchanged glances in Magenta. The crumbling traditions of this kingdom need urgent rebuilding. The brown-haired fellow looked down and answered that the Magina River, which crosses the road, needs to build a new outpost. The woman raised an eyebrow in displeasure. The hero did not lift his head and thought that she must not like his answer because she expected something else. But knowing her nature, the woman will not stop there. A character with a powerful and absolute force, trying to be equal with everyone and acting according to conscience, the queen gives everyone a chance to share their view. Alicia narrowed her eyes and asked what the reason was. The young man scowled and said that someone might think that the main palace needed urgent rebuilding. The redhead scowled. The fellow added that, a long time ago, an evil dragon attacked the tower twice to prevent a third attack. The roof of the main building was made flatter and wider for fear that the roof could be fully destroyed. The main building of the kingdom became very heavy. Lloyd leaned on his knee and said that this weight pressed on the pillars in the foundation of the building, weakening them more and more each time. However, the moment to fix this flaw would not come soon. He believed that this was not the most urgent task. The woman looked at him with displeasure but stayed silent. She thought that this was a very bold young man. Even knowing what answer was in her mind, he dared to give a different one. Alicia lifted her chin. The boy grinned and thought that he knew that the queen knew that he himself had given a different answer, although he knew what was on her mind. The redhead continued to look. Realizing that the listener knew that she knew that, even if in her head she had meant something else, he still answered wrongly. The smile widened on the hero's face. He knew that the queen knew that he knew that she knew that, even if in her mind she already had an answer, he answered differently. The system begged this crazy fool to stop. The queen chuckled, mentally asking if the boy had decided to play with her. The hero looked at her innocently and thought that he was only asking for food, a new order, and payment. Lloyd said that the current bridge over the Magina River had already been fixed 12 times. It cannot withstand the spring flood and collapses from time to time. When the bridge falls again, the usual way of life of the folks will be disrupted, and the monarch will again need a lot of cash. This particular structure needs rebuilding due to natural events. The brown-haired fellow closed his eyes and said that, if only the queen could instruct them to do this, they would build a bridge that would not be afraid of either floods or ice drifts. The fellow was talking about a modern suspension bridge. The woman scowled, noticing that this bold and reckless man was judging her. The noble swallowed, and the knight glanced at him nervously. The listener pressed her lips and thought that the more they talked, the more she liked it. Alicia asked to keep talking about the bridge he wanted to build. The hero grinned and thanked her. The young man knew that she would like it. Flatterers are disliked, but those who are sure in themselves and their beliefs are rewarded with generous trust. Lloyd began to chatter, describing all the benefits of his idea, and the queen stopped him, explaining that she was suddenly no longer interested in it. That's Queen Magenta for you, however. She will be betrayed by the one she loves the most. She will lose her arm and become a fierce monarch, but this story will happen only in 3 years. Now the woman is a good queen, ready to listen to even the poorest farmer. The redhead looked at the guest and asked what would happen if this bridge fell. The fellow thought that, in this case, he would pack his things and go overseas, but he replied that she could cut off his head. The brown-haired fellow looked up and asked to keep the status of his family while this bridge stood. The queen grinned and noticed that he still managed to make her laugh. She waved her hand and said that she would allow him to do as he wanted. The woman promised him a fair reward in the preservation of the status of his family. The hero crawled closer to her and handed over a scroll, explaining that he needed to sign a deal. Alicia scowled and was upset. Did the fellow really not believe her words? She was shocked that this fellow had prepared a deal in advance. The hero bowed and explained that the document stated that, if he was dishonest in his words, he would face the most severe punishment. He asked to consider this as a necessary step, coming from a humble man who could not be trusted. The listener looked at him in confusion but obediently signed. Alicia thought that she had a feeling that she was being pulled into something, but she was not angry at all. The young man bent over, sticking out his rear, and thanked her. The woman asked why he stuck out his rear. The hero explained that he physically could not lower his head lower in front of her, so he tried to lower himself as much as possible. The redhead asked to lower his rear, not wanting to see it. Lloyd and the knight walked down the hall, accompanied by the butler. The young man put his foot on his toe and spun. The brown-haired fellow made a proud face and pointed at the scroll, showing with all his appearance that this fellow outsmarted everyone right in front of the queen and got the deal. Xavier scowled and thought that the lord's rude behavior almost cost him his head. He would not be able to block the sword of the sword master, so there is no need to cross the line. Imperial Knight Kale looked at the queen and noted that Lloyd was clever and did great calculations. The woman grinned, sitting on the throne, and agreed, adding that the young man was more confident than she imagined. The man scowled and said that it seemed to him that the ruler was unhappy about something. The listener answered yes and explained that the guest was trying to outsmart her from the very start. Alicia smirked and added that he did it so simply that it was even cute. A couple of days later, the hero tossed a bag over his back. The knight approached him and asked if he could really handle it alone. The brown-haired fellow turned around and asked why he needed guards in a kingdom with an unmatched safety system. He made a face and said that being anywhere with Xavier was very uncomfortable. Even earlier, when checking the area, he could not focus because crowds of girls were chasing the knight. The swordsman looked at the young man and asked him to pass on his warmest wishes to Mr. Julian. The hero waved his hand and replied that he understood. Julian Fry is Lloyd's younger brother, who is currently studying at the Royal Academy. Before going to the royal road, the Baron packed a bunch of warm clothes to give to him. The noble walked down the street and wondered what was in the story at this time. The Baron's family was completely broke, and they were unable to pay for his education, as a result of which he was thrown out of the dormitory, and Julian died, having run into a thief while wandering the streets at night. The brown-haired fellow grinned and decided that this would definitely not happen now, and how great he was that he saved someone else's life. He moved toward the academy to go meet his little brother, whose face he did not even know. The Royal Academy of the Kingdom of Magenta. The hero looked down where a grumpy green-eyed boy was staring at him. He asked what the boy had come for. The brown-haired fellow narrowed his eyes, thinking that his brother was the same age as Xavier, but he was just a kid. From the angry look on Julian's face, one could tell that Lloyd was real. The fellow decided that he would not suspect anything if he did not treat him kindly. He tossed the sack to the kid and said that his mom had packed it for him. Julian scowled, not trusting that he wasn't labeled a rotten fool and that his sibling had come on behalf of his mother. Look, because of your too nice actions. The kid doesn't believe you. The hero was upset. What niceness was there in his actions? Acting like this, Lloyd, is very exhausting. The brown-haired guy turned around and said that he was going. The kid frowned and was shocked that he didn't even smack him. Look, doubts are strengthened by such kind behavior. The lad was stunned that he even called the child a brat, almost struck him. The hero paused, recalling how the Baroness asked him to eat dinner with his sibling. He scratched his head angrily under the kid's sharp gaze. The brown-haired guy turned around and asked if there was any good eatery nearby. The other person answered that there was, but so what? The guy said that he would get him something to eat. He carefully added the word brat at the end of each sentence. Julian asked why. The guy sighed and explained that his mom told him to. The kid scowled. Later in the eatery, the brothers sat at the table facing each other. Julian squinted at the menu and mumbled that he wanted something plain. The hero raised an eyebrow and asked to pick something pricier, while there was still the chance to eat in such a place. There was a pause while the child stared at his sibling. The brown-haired guy quickly fixed himself and called him a brat. The kid tensed up and was shocked that the guy forgot to call him a brat right away. The child switted and said that he would have a dish from the cook. Julian did not get why the other person acted normally and did not curse at everyone and did not kick him. The hero looked at the server and ordered 2 dishes from the cook. The man bowed and asked if the noble would like something to drink. Lloyd replied that he stopped drinking, so there was no need. The kid was stunned that a guy who drank all day long had quit alcohol a few days ago. A certain man came from Wango. He shared a tale about the trading town of Creo being attacked by a huge titan. The kid couldn't believe that the man who defeated the monster was Lloyd. The child simply didn't trust it because his sibling had neither smarts nor skills. Julian thought that it was either a rumor or the kid had taken the credit of his night for himself. The hero calmly ate a steak. The child scowled and thought that this was odd and unusual, even if nice, but in front of him was like a totally different person. Suddenly, a blond guy came up and hit the kid on the head. Lloyd looked up. The stranger looked at the child and asked why he was sitting there. Julian sweated and stammered that this was just how things happened. The other person hit the kid on the head and asked what he had been taught in law class. He kept hitting the child, asking if he could really break the rules whenever he wanted. The hero put the utensils on the table and glanced aside. The bully said that the Baron's family did not eat in busy places because it could cause unneeded trouble. The students at the next table laughed, and the bully insulted the kid. The cook and the server also acted like nothing was happening. Lloyd crossed his arms and thought that even at the academy, the family's rank was more important than knowledge, and it was not right for the son of a poor estate in the wilds to be so close to the leaders. The guy thought that if he helped his sibling now, it would only make his life at the academy harder. Besides, the kid himself was signaling for him to stay out of it, though with tears in his eyes. He saw bruises on his arms. The blonde grinned and said that in his house, there was a Renata known across the kingdom. The young man added that he had to at least achieve this to have the right to eat here. The brown-haired guy looked up in surprise and recalled Viscount Rona. The hero leaned on his hands making calculations. His face twisted into a smirk. Calculations done. The bully turned around when asked what his dad did. Lloyd stood up and walked up to the bully. The student raised his eyebrows and bragged that his dad was the wise and modest Viscount Rona, who had earned everything himself. He scowled and demanded that the brat's kin get lost. At that moment he got a solid slap. The young man spun from the hit, and a tooth flew out. The bully did a spin in the air and crashed into the wall. The hero looked at his hand and thought that the attack skill, Mono's slap, worked perfectly. The system noted that he did not have such a skill. Another student stood up from the table and yelled, "How dare some filthy fool treat their top student like that?" The next slap went to him. The hero didn't hold back on his dentist tricks, knocking out everyone's teeth. A second-year student nicknamed Ripping Fist approached him and warned him to prepare for death. His fate was the same. 2 twins with dyed hair approached and asked who dared to mess with their people. Someone shouted that the brothers called the double horns of the Black Dragon had arrived. The guy wouldn't dare raise a finger against their awesome moves. Lloyd crossed his arms and attacked with a double slap. He walked up to the kid who had just been praising the twins and gave him a face massage. The other 2 students who had been laughing at first cowered and hid their faces in the table, shaking. They mumbled that they hadn't said anything. The brown-haired guy loomed over them and reminded them that they had left one swing, and the Tooth Fairy got new prizes. Rana's son, with his teeth knocked out, swung and hit him in the face. He showed his teeth and asked how he liked the Mona blow delivered by such a great fighter, Diego Ricona 21. The kid stared ahead stunned. Later, the young man regretted it. The hero licked the blood from his face and laughed darkly. That hit was clearly not worth giving. Lloyd showed his teeth, and grabbing the student by the chest, struck him hard with his head. The blonde went limp in his arms. The noble lifted the bully up, and he begged him to stop. The hero repeated, "Did the move right in the forehead." Julian looked at his sibling with worry and thought that he had totally lost his mind. What a fool the kid was, even for a second, thinking that he was normal. The child turned to the place where the deputy director stood, but there was no one there anymore. Lloyd slammed Diego into the wall. He smirked and mumbled that the kid must not get what was happening and why he was being beaten. The brown-haired guy pressed the victim tighter and mimicked his words about Viscount Rona. The student mumbled that he had gone too far by insulting his parents. The hero thoroughly wiped the wall with the kid's face and shouted that he had no special status to mock others. He knocked on the wall with Diego's face and asked why he had to teach such simple things to a rude jerk. All because the blonde doesn't have someone beside him who will beat him up every time. The noble pointed to the bloody mark of his face on the wall and asked what it looked like. The next second, he hit the guy again, saying that this is the 66th gate of hell for such trash who waste air for nothing. Julian grabbed his sibling and asked him to stop right now, otherwise he will kill the student. The kid closed his eyes and wondered why he was protecting him at all, because it will be worse for him later. He looked up at his sibling, who asked if the kid was really scared that he would be bullied even more later. Lloyd smiled and asked him not to worry because a dead body couldn't hurt him. Julian turned pale, not getting why the guy looked like he was proud of himself. The hero punched the bully in the stomach and thought that in high school, he saw enough jerks like that who did whatever they wanted. He rejected any form of mercy for him. The blonde coughed. After all, the fear of death was something unique. The voice ordered to stop right away. The guards surrounded them. The man scowled and exclaimed that this was a holy academy, which was under the protection of Her Majesty the Queen, and this was betrayal. The hero straightened up, holding Diego by the hair. Julian looked at him in fear, wondering if his sibling was capable of attacking the dean too. The brown-haired guy bowed and introduced himself. The kid scowled, not getting why he was so calm, as if he was ready for this. Lloyd smiled and bowed, saying sorry for causing such a fuss. He glanced at the dean and said that he was only fixing the insulted honor of Her Highness. The man scowled and replied that this was nonsense and who would dare to shame the honor of the queen. The guy replied that it was Raken's son who did it, and his younger sibling suffered from bullying and insults. The hero looked at the deputy who had seen everything, and asked if he really had nothing to say. The man began to sweat while the brown-haired guy was telling him that he had no wish to stop him. They didn't need to understand why he hadn't stopped. It was because the staff of this academy was hired on the suggestions of the nobility. That's why they didn't want to see anything except these very nobility. So the students felt free and dared to act as they wanted. Those who grew up here and brought the academy to such chaos. And it's not just the students, the teachers are great too. The men looked at him nervously. The hero thought that he would never have stayed away if he had learned that Julian was being bullied. He hadn't paid attention to them until now since he was just the son of a poor baron, so there was little point in his helping. The kid narrowed his eyes and thought that by insulting his younger sibling, they had insulted him. The dean scowled and asked what this had to do with Her Majesty. Lloyd put his hand in his pocket and said that by insulting his sibling they had insulted him. He took out and opened the item. The academic stared at it in shock. The brown-haired guy smiled and said that it was a special royal pass for an important guest. Suddenly even a glow surrounded him and everyone knelt down saluting the queen. The hero put his hands in his pockets and headed for the exit since they understood what had just happened here. The dean narrowed his eyes and thought that this fool did not know that the status of a royal guest applied to only one person. They could punish Julian after he left. The man shuddered, looking at the kid. The hero grinned threateningly. The dean quickly lowered his head and thought that he was trying to say that he would finish him off if he pulled some trick. Lloyd looked at his sibling and hurried him. They walked down the hall together. The kid glanced sideways at the hero and asked where they were going. The brown-haired guy replied that they needed to go to the administrative center so that the young man could take a school break. He turned around in surprise at his sibling who had stopped. Julian scowled and asked how far he was going to go to satisfy his pride. Now they would put even more pressure on him at the academy, and he wouldn't be allowed to study either. The other man smiled and replied that it would be tough for him to study in such a place anyway, so he should relax and start training. Lloyd grinned and said that there was a saying that the best way to build strength was through hard work. Night had fallen on the royal palace, the rooms of important guests. Xavier looked at the kid sitting across from him and asked him to think about Mr. Lloyd's advice because it would lead to good results. The child argued that it was about his useless sibling. The knight looked at his companion intently and asked if he didn't trust his words either. Julian stared at him in shock. The swordsman told him that the hero had single-handedly fought a huge titan and even survived a deadly hit. The noble had built a road and a water system and had also started digging coal in the mines and made friends with wild orcs. The young man listened in shock. The knight added that Lloyd had managed to pay off most of the baron's huge debt and had done all this alone. The warrior looked at the kid and asked him to trust him now. It was his older sibling who ran the estate. The hero froze and in the hallway, reaching for the door handle, he rubbed his nose in embarrassment, hearing the knight's words. Julian sat down on the couch and replied that he really wanted to believe his words, but it was hard to accept that this drunk had changed so much. The companion agreed that the gentleman was foolish and proud. The child said that his sibling was real garbage. The swordsman added that it was hard to believe that he was even human. Lloyd froze with an empty look. The student looked at the knight and asked if it was possible for someone to change so much. The blonde replied that it was impossible. Xavier scowled and said that he thought that this person was someone else, just looked like Mr. Lloyd. The hero scowled. There was a pause. The kid looked at the companion in shock and asked if someone was using his sibling's body with dark magic. The knight closed his eyes and replied that it could be so if such a thing was even possible. The brown-haired guy scowled as the swordsman explained that there was such an idea in the book, but to transfer a soul to another body, a very large amount of power was needed. He secretly decided to test it. Xavier said that Lloyd's soul was linked by a very strong flow of power. The hero opened his mouth, shocked that the warrior actually did this. The student scowled and asked if the soul of another was there. The brown-haired guy narrowed his eyes, waiting for an answer. The knight closed his eyes and said that the body and soul felt natural, as if one whole. The noble sighed in relief. The swordsman looked at the kid and noted that these were just silly guesses. The child argued that it was even sillier to think that he had changed so much. The hero stared ahead and thought that there was no way Xavier could not sense his presence behind the door. He must have wanted the master to hear it. The kid shuddered when he heard his younger sibling say that he knew about the family's debts. The kid looked away and mumbled that he thought he was the only one trying hard all this time. His sibling had done so much to cover the debt. It was easier for a child. Julian smiled and said that he had to admit that his older sibling had saved their estate. Notification: Julian's liking towards you has gone up by 2 points. Bonus RP gain 28. Liking towards you minus 59. The hero grinned and thought that he could earn points for his sibling too. The system wrote that the ice in the little sibling's heart had cracked. The kid replied that it was time to move on. He entered the room and told his sibling that it was time to start. Lloyd smiled and reminded him that he had promised training. The first step was to prepare the suspension cables of the bridge. The noble pounded the shovel to crush the dirt and knead the dough a meter thick. The second step: finish making the dough by tossing in other types of dirt and rocks as ingredients. The third step was to feed everything to Belle. The fourth step was to release the steel from the snake path. The fifth step was to roll the steel into 120 bundles of wires using padong. When the steel cooled, the rope was done. The hero handed his sibling a shovel and said that that was it. He pointed and said that this process was the starting point of the whole project. If you mess up here, it would be the end. The kid added that, besides the estate's debt, this would also decide his fate at the academy. The kid stared at his sibling in shock, holding the tool. Julian looked awkwardly at the brown-haired guy and asked why he should be trusted with such an important job. The hero turned around and said that this was a very important job, so such a clever and dependable young man should do it. He quickly added an insult at the end. The child looked at his sibling in shock and was surprised that he called him a jerk again. Lloyd headed for the exit with a smile, and the knight followed. The brown-haired guy was carrying rolled-up plans and was thinking that building a suspension bridge with the tools of this era was not an easy job. He was sure that he could not manage alone. The guy firmly looked ahead and was going to borrow a power beyond tools. He looked at the building from the pipes of which smoke was pouring. The royal dwarf worker, Gus, tore himself away from the bottle and refused. The hero smiled and noted that he had not said anything yet. The companion took a sip and said that he did not want to hear anything. The brown-haired guy grinned and thought that everything was as described in the story: an old and grumpy old man. If he was not interested, he would not even move, even by a decree of the queen. However, the guy also had a trick up his sleeve. Lloyd unrolled the drawing and said that it was a plan for building a bridge over the Majuna River, and it was called the structure of the rafter truss. The dwarf threatened with a bottle and exclaimed that he was not interested in human projects. Suddenly, he squinted and looked at the drawing. The hero rolled up the paper and mumbled that then it was worth dropping this topic. The noble dramatically turned to the exit, saying that he would look for another workshop. Chorus put the bottle on the table and stopped him. He said that if the overall structure was not strong enough, what would happen then? The man asked if the guy had designed it. The hero froze and replied that the structure would fall apart, the bridge would collapse, and all the people on it would die, and the guy would take blame for their deaths and be hanged on the guillotine. The dwarf scowled. Lloyd turned around with wild eyes and mumbled that if only Sidus would take up the matter. The companion shuddered in shock and began to sweat. He exclaimed, "What kind of threat was that?" The brown-haired guy smiled and replied that it was more of a call to conscience. The dwarf asked if they were trying to scare him. The worker was breathing heavily. He extended his hand and asked to take a closer look. Sidus looked at the plans while the guy stood across. Finally, the dwarf crossed his arms and said that in the whole kingdom, he was the only one who could do this. If he trusted someone else with this, then expect big trouble. The noble narrowed his eyes and said that that was why he was trying to pressure him, that is, to beg. The companion mumbled that this sneaky fool was trying to impress him. Chorus looked at the guy and asked if he had any plans to spark his interest, since he was clever enough to design this. The hero, without changing his face, replied that he had no choice but to rely on the kind-hearted man master worker. The man asked him to stop making such a face. Lloyd made a perfect bow and thanked him, hearing that the dwarf agreed to join the project. Meanwhile, Julian continues to make cables with the help of magical creatures. The bridge deck is being made in the royal workshop, and he and Xavier begin to build the main tower. The hero and the swordsman stuck tools into the ground and used explosive methods. Someone approached them and demanded that they stop building right away. The man with the guards raised his hand and shouted, "How dare they trick the royal family and steal the national wealth?" Lloyd scowled and asked again with annoyance. Two men bowed before the queen asking for mercy. One of them scowled and exclaimed that the bridge over the Magenta River had stood for 30 years. The guy was doing unneeded things to grab the royal money. They asked to punish the cheater and return the money to the royal treasury. Alicia looked at them closely. The queen with the knight, the hero with Xavier, and two unhappy nobles gathered at the meeting table. The woman said that she wanted to hear the reasons of both sides. She leaned on her arm and suggested starting with the guild. Victor, the leader of the building guild of the royal capital Magenta, scowled and said that the bridge built by the previous leader of the guild had stood for 30 years. The wedge-shaped support of the bridge spreads the strong current of the river. He added that it was unthinkable to think that such a bridge would fall. By saying this, the guy insults the guild and the queen. The hero looked at him blankly and thought that, by the way, the bridge was already breaking apart. The brown-haired guy squinted and recalled that in the story, The Knight of Iron and Blood, there is a chapter that tells about the clash between the government forces and the rebels, and at that time a heavy rain starts to fall, which washes away the bridge and it falls. However, the young man cannot talk about the future. The queen looked at him and asked him to share his view. The guy said that he would like to talk to the official sitting next to him and not the guild leader. Lloyd grinned and asked how much he got. The man turned pale and asked again, and his partner shook. The official slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "How dare he throw false claims right in front of the queen?" The noble smiled and thought that the companion was literally yelling, "I got my money in Korea." Any fool knows what happens when politicians meet traitors. Either the politicians set up the traitors, or the traitors bribe the officials and get support. In this case, it's most likely the latter. They plan to take over the money by stripping them of the right to operate. The brown-haired guy looked at the ruler. The woman scowled and said that she thought he was a clever guy, but he had just made a terrible mistake. The young man swallowed nervously. The men smiled happily while Alicia was upset that the guy dared to accuse a royal official without proof. She scowled and ordered them to prepare for the trial. The hero was tied up, and the executioner was already standing over him. The queen looked down and said that he had insulted her and her subjects with his lies. The woman added that she wanted to restore their damaged honor. Xavier looked at the master in shock, and the animal sat on his shoulders in fear. The knight placed his hand on the hilt of his sword. Alicia lifted her chin and asked if the kid had anything to say. The hero lowered his head and said that a guilty man ruins his parents. Xavier scowled. The two men bowed to the queen and said that everyone gets what they deserve. The knight clutched his sword. The redhead said that from now on, she would prove her subjects' innocence. The official and the guild leader sweated and asked again. Several mages surrounded the man, and Lloyd grinned darkly. The queen held out her hand and ordered the confession spell to be done. The man looked around in fear and asked to wait. The mages held out their hands and summoned magic circles. The hero laughed with his signature grin. Birds flew in the sky. The birds perched on the poles to which the queen's former subjects were tied. Lloyd and Xavier looked at them. The brown-haired guy said that their families were innocent, so he begged for such a punishment for them. The young man smiled and mumbled what a kind person he was. The knight still had that devilish grin in his eyes. The hero was just a little annoyed because they had to stop building because of those fools. Alicia made a hand gesture and ordered all the people of the kingdom to devote themselves to building the suspension bridge. Long live the queen! Thanks to the skilled mages who use gravity magic, they managed to lighten the weight of the blocks, so the tower was built in an instant. The hero ordered Belle, who was holding the rope, to prepare to launch. The kid put out his hand and shouted that it was time. The snake flew forward. The people watched this show. Kadong was waiting for her on the other tower. The hamster caught Belle with the rope, which was quickly connected to the socket. The hero ordered to move to the second rope. Xavier watched from the crowd. Standing next to him, Julian mumbled that his sibling was so awesome. The swordsman smiled and noted that the kid was also a good kid since he tirelessly did tough work that he had never known about before. The knight recalled that, as a child, Julian said that he wanted to learn the skill of using a sword, but the weapon was so heavy that he almost hurt himself. The young man looked at his companion in shock. Xavier looked at the student's strong arms and added that this would not be a problem for him now. Hippo lifted the platform out of the water, and the mages used the art of destruction to melt it. The hero swung his shovel and, having stuck it into the ground, shouted happily. Notification: the building of the suspension bridge in the royal capital of M is complete. You have been given a large amount of bonus RP for your success in building. Bonus points plus 1050, number of RP 319. The hero did not spend them and now he was able to save up. The kid knelt before the queen. The woman announced that the bridge would be named after Lloyd Ftur and his brave knight. It would be called Roy Habby. The government also gave the kid the title of chief worker. Cetus, standing in the crowd with a bottle, was shocked that such a kid had been given such a title since he had made the bridge's covering. However, the dwarf admitted that only Lloyd could have created such a wonder. Now that they had received such a large payment for the building, the estate's debt issue was solved. The hero closed his eyes and thought that there was still one big problem left. He squinted and exchanged glances with the queen. Alicia thought that there were many more places where she could use such a talent. The kid guessed that the queen was thinking about how else to use him, but his dream was to be rich and jobless. But he needed to act according to the plan. The woman looked at him and said that there was one more task that needed to be discussed at the palace. The hero thought there was something that would help get rid of the king's control and solve Julian's problems at the academy. Lloyd smiled and replied that he would do as he was told. He would hit two birds with one